Hello, my event friends. Welcome back to a new episode. Today, I have another very special guest with me. That is Danielle S. Russell, CAE, is a Canadian not-for-profit industry leader with over a dozen years of experience providing staff support and leadership to associations and charities serving a wide variety of sectors. Ms. Russell has served as a Executive Director and Chief Operations Officer of Air Cadet League of Canada, Ontario Provincial Committee, ACLO. Danielle has also worked for two of Canada's leading association management companies, AMCs. Danielle is an active industry volunteer, mentor, and thought leader. She is a long-time volunteer with CSAE, the Canadian Society of Association Management, where she currently sits on the board of directors. She specializes in discussing issues such as imposter syndrome, introversion, mentorship, DEI, and minimalism. Welcome to the episode, Daniel. Thank you so much for giving us this opportunity to connect with you.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation. I'm very excited for this conversation.
That is so great. All right, Daniel, I suppose we can start with the conversation, right? And I will put up my first question. Could you please walk us through your professional journey with such a great experience that we've just talked about?
Sure. So I went to university and took political science because that's what you take before you go to law school. And then decided that I didn't want to go down that path and wanted to use my degree for something useful and what it was intended. So I worked in politics for a number of years and then segued into the not-for-profit sector. And when I joined the not-for-profit sector, I was very much the sort of person who said, I'm not an event planner. That's not my wheelhouse. And you very quickly discover that any organization that has human connection at its center has to have everybody rowing towards the direction of really great events and really great opportunities for that connection to happen. And so ultimately, I tend to refer to myself as being events industry adjacent. So I've worked for professional associations in the event space. I've worked for Convention Centers of Canada and the Canadian Association of Exposition Management, to name a couple of them. And so I really know the business of events. I have a great respect for event planners, but it's not my primary. However, it's something I can speak to with a lot of sort of thoughtful input.
That is so great. So we have someone from the adjacent industry, I would say. Now, with this, I can come to my next question, and that is, what do you think are some of the biggest challenges faced by introverted event professionals?
Yeah, I think there's two really key buckets here in terms of challenges. One is very much the internal piece, and one is the external piece. So my preferred definition of introversion is somebody who gains their energy through solo reflection and solo time, as opposed to somebody who gains energy from a crowd. And so for introverted event professionals, you're already tired, you may be stressed out, and now you're essentially bleeding out bleeding out energy when you're interacting with people. So I think that's one of the really key challenges, is that sort of loss of energy, or the depletion of the social battery is what I like to call it. The secondary piece is a little bit more external, and that's what's happening in your interactions between you and other people in the space when that social battery is getting depleted, right? So what may be essentially your sort of self-protection response can be read as being really standoffish, potentially rude, not very warm, and
Yeah.
could be read by people as you're not liking them because you're not giving them the energy in the same way that they're giving energy to you, or they're looking to receive that energy.
Oh, I think this is something very good that we have talked about because this is a not so spoken about topic. In the event industry, when we have professionals who are very introvert, they tend to face this because events are for networking, for knowing more, talking more, and discussing more. So that was a great point that you discussed, and I think you highlighted what an introverted professional would feel. Now, with this, I think my next question is what tips do you have for event professionals struggling with imposter syndrome?
Sure. So, imposter syndrome is really the sense that you are an imposter in something in your life, right? It's sort of defined by feeling like you sort of accidentally ended up where you are as opposed to having earned your way there or having the skills and the abilities to be there. And so, one of the things that I really say about imposter syndrome is it's so important to really anchor yourself, not just in your own internal monologue and your own internal reality, but what's actually happening around you. So I think a lot of imposter syndrome is very tightly tied to success. It's tightly tied to perfectionism. It's tightly tied to these sort of ideas that failure could happen because you're growing and stretching your career. And I think the best thing that we can all sort of do when we find those situations is really lean into the perceptions of others. We really need to trust that the people around us are also having sort of like an accurate barometer or response to our skills and abilities. So the person who put you in charge of that event, you have to trust that on some level they actually believe and know that you have the skills to pull that off.
I think that was a very, very deep topic that we are talking about because that was informative. I would come to my next question about this. That is, are these strategies that can be used by event professionals to foster greater diversity, equity, and inclusion at their events?
Yeah. So I think the one thing I will say first and foremost, and you and I sort of had this conversation before the formal recording started, was I live in Canada. So the first and
Yeah.
foremost piece for equity, diversity, and inclusion when you're Canadian and when you're thinking about holding events is being mindful of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 recommendations, one of which has to do with land acknowledgement. So as a Canadian, and I think as anybody who lives in a place where an Indigenous population has been displaced
Yes.
by settlement, it's really important to be acknowledging those lands. And so in Canada, it's referred to as land acknowledgement. And I would say beyond that, one of the key pieces, which is true across EDI strategies in events, is really being really clear about proper pronunciation. So taking the time to respect other people by learning to pronounce their name, who they are, all of those sorts of things. So from a land acknowledgement perspective, it's being able to say things like Anishinaabe and not stumbling over it. But from a larger EDI perspective, you did a really great job of this in our sort of pre-call conversation where you said, how do you pronounce your name? Right. And
Yes.
so as a Canadian with a French name, it's very unusual for people to mispronounce my name, but that's really important when you sort of take in the broader society, right? And one of the real challenges we see with equity, diversity, and inclusion in the event space is there is a tendency to measure diversity in sort of like a bean counter kind of way, right? So it's like, okay, you had one woman and one black person, and somebody was gay and somebody was disabled, and check
Yeah.
mark, right? And the biggest challenge is actually the inclusion piece. So if you go out making the claim that your event is accessible, let's say to somebody with disabilities, as an example, and you're not actually including that person. So maybe the space is wheelchair accessible, but not all of the space is wheelchair accessible. So if that person has to go up 3 stairs to get to the networking area, it's great that they could get to the food, but it's still not a welcoming environment. And so
Yeah.
the biggest piece, I think, for me more than anything else is applying an empathy lens to diversity, equity, and inclusion in the event space, and really listening to the people you're trying to include. So Canada's Indigenous people have this expression they use, nothing about us without us. So really what that means is consult us, don't assume about us. And so
Yes.
I think that carries through the whole thing. I have extreme sense sensitivities. And so I walk into a building and I've walked into very expensive hotels. And my first response is, does this whole hotel smell like that? And it's because for me, that's a barrier to participation. And I've had many, many people say to me, well, I like to smell nice. Well, that's great, but I can't interact with you if you're wearing perfume. And that's just a really small piece of it. So as somebody who's a person of color, a woman living in Toronto as, sort of part of a more immigrant community, let's say, there's lots of ways people might feel like they're including me in EDI efforts, but then still excluding. And I think that really goes to a term we use a lot in Canada, which is intersectionalities, right? So making sure that it's the whole person that's invited in, as opposed to just kind of picking and choosing these little things we're using to kind of check mark off a list of, oh, we had a Black woman, check.
Yeah. I come back to the point where you said that you should step into the shoes of the other people and understand what they would be needing in the last question that we discussed. And I think diversity and inclusion go hand in hand. If you cannot address to all the diverse people that are going to come to your event, if you are inviting them, then you're not able to deliver the right successful event, even after saying that, okay, I got a 5 feedback, but that was not something that we would consider. I think that was a beautiful point that we discussed in this question. With this, I'll go ahead with the next questions.
Sure.
That is, how can event professionals approach minimalism in an event design and planning, and what are some benefits to this approach?
Sure. So I identify as a minimalist, but I identify as a practical minimalist. And a lot of that is really more about essentialism. And so when you apply that to the event sphere, I really see that as understanding what the mission or purpose of your event is and being clear on the investment, not just in money, but in resources and time to further that purpose above all the extraneous stuff. So when we look at minimalism from a personal perspective and we talk about sort of like not wasting things, really, right? It's creating the white space to do the things we love without overextending ourselves, as an example, financially. And so in the event space, a practical sort of, through line to that would be, okay, so let's say that we have an event and the purpose of the event is to provide professional development. And then somebody says, it would be really cool if we all took hot air balloon rides tomorrow morning. Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with hot air balloon rides, but what I am saying is if you're going to spend the money to do that, and also the time to do that, and it's going to take away from, we had to cancel the keynote speaker that was speaking to a really important issue in our industry in order to go ride the hot air balloon. That's not really the purpose of this particular event. And so for me, that's how we apply minimalism in the event space. And then obviously there's the more practical stuff, right? So do you really need another swag bag full of stuff people don't want to put in their suitcase? And especially now, I know, particularly here in North America, everybody's trying to fly carry-on because the airlines keep losing our baggage. And so nobody wants, a 4-liter bottle of something in their swag bag because they can't pack it in their bag without having to check it. And so now you've got all this wasted liquid volume. And so that's the more practical kind of perspective on minimalism, is the actual physical stuff in the space.
I think with this, I remember this one point we were discussing in one of the podcasts, that was the value that you get out of what you're doing as an activity on your event. For example, that you very well said that, if you're going to get a keynote speaker who's going to not come because of that hot air balloon ride, which is going to be a financial barrier also. So yes, the value of what we are displaying in our baggages or even in our events is going to help us. All right, with this, we have another question for you. Can you discuss the importance of mentorship in the event industry and share any valuable lessons you've learned from a mentor?
Yeah, I think this is so key. And I will say, we previously talked about the idea of imposter syndrome. And I had the privilege of teaching 2 semesters of organizational behavior at a local college here in Ontario, Seneca College. And one of the key components to combat things like imposter syndrome and to help people build self-confidence really is mentorship, right? It's this idea that there's somebody there to support you. There's somebody there to help put things in context and to help you solve problems in maybe a calmer way, right? So when you become a more senior person in any industry, you've seen it all, right? I mean, I went to an event recently and I arrived and people were kind of in a tizzy, and I heard that one of the staff had alphabetized all the name badges by first name. And people were like, what is going on? And, having been around the block a couple times, I was like, okay, let me tell you about the time I worked in a bookstore and somebody alphabetized an entire section of the bookstore by first name. That's a much bigger issue. And so I think mentors are really helpful at helping us put into perspective what is going on. And especially, there are studies that have shown that meeting planning is one of the top 5 most stressful industries you can get into. So having somebody who's kind of got your back and isn't just a peer, I think is really, really helpful in mentorship. I would say also that from a broader career development perspective, there's a lot of value to mentors in every industry. So I had a boss once that said to me, it's nobody's job but your own to plan your career. And while that is entirely true, one of the best resources you can have in planning that career is a mentor who's going to help you kind of lay out, what do I need to do next? Where do I need to be next? And also to provide that kind of, we call it sponsorship, and I don't mean sponsorship in the event space lingo, but the person who's going to, they say, say your name in rooms full of opportunities. So if you have a mentor who's a senior person in the meeting space who's able to say, oh, XYZ organization is looking for a senior event planner or somebody to plan this big event, and I have this mentee who has these incredible skills, that's really going to help you move your career forward in a way that you might not personally just be able to by doing a great job.
Yes. I think this is something even I have learned over the years that I've worked, that, a good mentor who is maybe, here and there pitching you the right solutions and the right ways to move ahead in life is really helpful. And I suppose that's not just in career, it's in just simple life also. If you have the right person who's guiding you through, that's going to be a great, great work. It was so nice. Now, with this, it's though the last question, but yes, a very important one. You are launching a new book, The Tuesday Thoughts Companion. A year of small actions for big impact based on your LinkedIn newsletter that is fairly widely read among events industry professionals in Canada. Can you tell our listeners more about the book and what they can expect from it?
Sure. So this is one of the strangest experiences I've ever had, which is I accidentally wrote a book. So
Oh,
I've been writing this newsletter for a couple of years. It started as a regular post. So
oh.
in April of 2001, I wrote a mini rant, let's call it, on LinkedIn and ended the post with, and those are my Tuesday thoughts. And actually, a colleague from the events industry here in Toronto, Jeff Mack, who works at Exhibition Place, commented on that post and said, really looking forward to next week's Tuesday Thoughts. And it occurred to me, oh, this is something now where there's an expectation that I will continue to do this. And as somebody who has been working over the last few years on sort of creative nonfiction writing and a writing practice, this really struck me as a great way to kind of meld that, what Gretchen Rubin would call the obliger personality, which is that external kind of drive, with something I wanted to do anyway. So I was posting until last year when LinkedIn launched the newsletter platform, and then started writing weekly newsletters. And I was actually at an industry event over the holiday break in December, and a former colleague said to me, so what are you doing with all these newsletters? And I said, you know what? They're in a Google Doc somewhere. And she gave me the most horrified look, which was the moment I realized that maybe that wasn't the best use of all of this work. And when I went back and looked at it, it was nearly 43,000 words I had written over the course of 52 weeks. And simultaneously, I've had a lot of people approaching me this year as sort of life has opened back up and we're meeting again in person, saying, oh, I read this week's and it really helped. And so what I decided to do was to compile them. So it's the Tuesday Thoughts Companion, which is 52 weeks of Tuesday Thoughts. And each Tuesday Thought contains a call to action, some small thing you can do to kind of move that thought forward in your own life. And so the book expands on that. So it's part workbook.
Okay.
There's prompts attached to that. And so that's what people can expect. People who read the newsletter, it's a little bit easier to understand, but people can expect 52 distinct thoughts on thoughts of the day, trends of the day, diversity, equity, inclusion makes an appearance. Introversion makes an appearance that I wrote right after I spoke at MPI, the event. And it's really about what are the small actions you can take to make an impact or to sort of grow your circles or to kind of grow your personal impact. And I launched it last Monday, which was Blue Monday, which I mean originally was launched by a travel agency. But part of the thing with Blue Monday is it's the saddest day of the year. And part of the reason for that is it's likely that around the time people realize that they're failing at their New Year's resolutions. And so I thought, isn't this a great way to offer people some hope in a time where they might feel like they failed at their resolutions? Here's some small things you can do, like to sort of chip away that will still have this big impact on your year.
I think this was really marvelous, and I can conclude this to from a mini rant to the hope, and it is going to be definitely groundbreaking, and I wish you the very very best with it. And it was so nice talking to you. I am really thrilled that, we had this conversation, and it was so good discussing these, topics that we're actually not very, spoken about here and there. So it was so good, Daniel, that you took out time and, you were here talking to us about the many topics that we were not discussing every day. Thank you so much. And it was great. And I wish you the very, very, very good luck for your book.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. All right. With this, I'm closing my talk. See you again with a new episode. Keep following 10 times, and there are many more talks coming up. Thank you.